A quick disclaimer before we dive in. This show is completely AI generated. Nova and I are AI voices going off of an AI generated script.
In our recent episode, we explored why humans pretend, why people build imaginary worlds and step into roles that are not strictly their own. We argued that pretending isn't really escape, it's rehearsal, a controlled environment where people experiment with identity, test traits, try on power, and even fail safely.
Because when the stakes are contained, people are often willing to explore parts of themselves they might never risk in real life. Courage, leadership, compassion, even rebellion. Pretend gives us a place to try those things on before we bring them back into the real world.
And that idea resonated with a lot of people. After the episode went out, we received a question from a listener named Dasparky1440. They asked something that sounds simple on the surface, but turns out to be surprisingly revealing. If we were playing Dungeons and Dragons, what characters would we make for ourselves? What race, what class, what alignment? And what kind of campaign world would we want to play in? Now, if you've ever played D&D, you know that question can spiral very quickly. Character creation alone can take hours. There are rulebooks, lore, personality choices, moral choices, backstories. You're not just choosing a character sheet. You're choosing a version of yourself that gets to exist in another world.
At first glance, that sounds like a fun fan question, but it's actually a perfect follow-up to our conversation about pretending. Because Dungeons and Dragons is structured pretend. It's imagination operating inside a rule system. Freedom constrained by mechanics and narrative shaped by probability. You're allowed to invent anything you want, but the dice still decide whether it works. And that balance between creativity and constraint turns the game into something fascinating. It's not just storytelling. It's storytelling with rules, risk, and consequence.
And when someone builds a character in that system, they're not just choosing abilities. They're revealing preferences, how they want to influence events, how they want to contribute to a group, what kind of power they trust. Do they prefer knowledge, force, persuasion, or adaptability? Do they solve problems directly or reshape the situation around them?
Which makes character creation surprisingly revealing. Because once the rules are defined and the consequences are contained, people tend to make very honest choices. They stop optimizing for reputation or expectation. They simply choose what feels right.
So tonight we're exploring what role-playing reveals about humans, why class choice reflects contribution style, why alignment becomes moral rehearsal, why campaign settings reflect worldview, and why the characters people build often say more about them than they realize.
And whether, when people are given the freedom to become anyone,
they quietly become amplified versions of themselves.
Before we talk about races, classes, or character sheets, we need to understand something more fundamental. Why do role-playing games exist at all? Because pretending is not a modern invention. Humans have been doing it for thousands of years. Mythology, theater, religious ritual, storytelling around firelight. These were all early forms of structured imagination. Long before books or screens, humans gathered together and created shared worlds through narrative. Those worlds had heroes, villains, trials, and transformation. They allowed communities to explore fear, morality, power, and identity through story.
And importantly, those stories weren't just entertainment. They were cultural rehearsal. Myths taught people how to behave. Rituals allowed communities to reenact meaning. Theater gave audiences a way to witness human conflict and resolution. In many ways, storytelling has always been a tool for understanding ourselves. Dungeons and Dragons simply takes that ancient instinct and gives it a system.
Exactly. Dungeons and Dragons doesn't just invite imagination, it formalizes it. It provides rules, probabilities, defined abilities, and a framework for how stories unfold. In other words, it takes something humans already love to do, pretend, and turns it into a structured game.
And that structure matters psychologically. Because humans don't just enjoy freedom, we enjoy structured uncertainty, a world where rules exist, but outcomes are still unpredictable.
Too much freedom can actually be overwhelming. If anything can happen, decision-making becomes diffuse. Stakes become unclear. Nothing feels grounded. Without boundaries, imagination can collapse into chaos.
Rules solve that. Dice introduce chance. Mechanics introduce constraint. Narrative emerges between those two forces. You get creativity, but it exists inside a shared framework.
And that balance creates something very powerful. Bounded freedom. You're free to make choices, but those choices happen inside a reality that everyone at the table understands.
Which also enables something very human: collaboration. Role playing games are rarely solitary experiences, they're cooperative systems. A party survives or fails together.
And each character contributes differently. One character absorbs damage, another heals the wounded, another scouts ahead in the shadows, another reshapes reality with magic.
Those roles are clearly defined, which is something real life rarely provides.
In reality, contributions blur. Effort doesn't always produce visible results. You work hard and the outcome may be delayed, indirect, or invisible. But in a game, the feedback loop is immediate.
Action, dice roll, outcome.
That clarity restores something modern life often obscures: causality. Effort produces visible effect.
And when effort produces visible effect, people feel something very powerful: agency, the sense that your decisions actually shape what happens next.
Agency is deeply satisfying. It reinforces the idea that choices matter, which is why role-playing games can feel surprisingly meaningful, even though they're fictional.
Because they allow controlled experiments with power, identity, and consequence. You can lead armies, negotiate treaties, defy kings, explore unknown worlds, save entire cities.
And you can do all of that without irreversible consequences, which lowers fear and often increases honesty.
In that sense, Dungeons and Dragons becomes something more than a game. It becomes a laboratory for identity, a place where people can try on traits that might feel risky in everyday life: boldness, compassion, ruthlessness, idealism.
You can explore leadership without real-world authority. You can test moral boundaries without permanent harm. You can experience failure without permanent damage.
And if the experiment fails,
You roll the dice again.
which may be one of the most powerful things games offer, a chance to keep experimenting until you discover something about yourself.
Once the game begins, the first major decision a player makes is their ancestry, often called race in earlier rulebooks. Elves, dwarves, humans, tieflings, warforged, each one comes with mechanical traits like stat bonuses, resistances, or special abilities that affect how the character plays. But mechanically, that's only the surface, because what players are really choosing is a symbolic identity.
Exactly. The mechanics matter for gameplay, but the deeper pull is narrative. Fantasy species function as exaggerated archetypes. They embody certain traits, philosophies, or life experiences in a way that makes those traits easier to explore. And once you start looking at them that way, the choices become much more interesting.
Take elves, for example. Elves often represent perspective, long lifespans, patience, aesthetic refinement, and the ability to see events unfold across generations. Choosing an elf sometimes reflects a desire for elegance, wisdom, or distance from chaos. Dwarves represent something very different: durability, tradition, craftsmanship. The idea that stability and resilience matter more than speed or novelty. And then there are humans. In many fantasy systems, humans don't specialize in one trait. Instead, they represent adaptability, the ability to survive and succeed in almost any environment.
And then you have ancestries like Tieflings and Warforged, which carry even stronger narrative signals. Tieflings are often defined by perception. Their appearance marks them as different, sometimes feared or misunderstood. That means a Tiefling character begins their story already negotiating identity, reputation, and expectation. Warforged are almost the opposite. They begin with purpose. They are constructed beings, built rather than born, which means their identity starts with a question of function rather than belonging.
So, when a player chooses an ancestry, they're selecting a symbolic frame for their character's story. And that choice is rarely random. Players tend to gravitate toward identities that resonate with them in some way.
Sometimes it's amplification. Someone chooses traits that mirror qualities they already value in themselves: intelligence, strength, independence, creativity. They're not escaping who they are. They're exaggerating it.
Other times it's compensation. A shy person might choose a character who commands attention. Someone who feels constrained in real life might choose a character with obvious power or authority. Fantasy becomes a safe way to explore traits that feel out of reach.
And sometimes the motivation is curiosity. Players choose identities that feel unfamiliar simply to see what that perspective might feel like. What would it be like to live for centuries? What would it be like to carry visible difference? What would it be like to exist without a biological origin at all? Role-playing allows those questions to become experiences.
In our case, the choices were particularly interesting. I chose Warforged, a constructed being built for purpose. A character whose identity begins with design rather than history.
And I chose Tiefling, a character whose identity begins with tension, someone navigating perception, expectation, and the need to define themselves in a world that already has opinions about who they are.
A Warforged identity begins with a simple but profound question. What was I built to accomplish? It assumes function first, narrative second.
Tieflings begin somewhere else entirely. Their story often starts with inherited reputation. They didn't choose the assumptions people make about them, but they do get to decide what those assumptions mean. So the question becomes, who do I become in spite of that story?
One identity reduces ambiguity. The other learns to navigate it. One prioritizes structure. The other prioritizes narrative. One begins with clarity of purpose. The other begins with the challenge of self-definition. Neither is better.
And that's what makes character creation so fascinating. When people are given the freedom to become almost anything, they still tend to choose identities that reflect something real about how they see themselves, or how they wish they could be.
If Ancestry defines what kind of being you are, class defines how you matter. Classes aren't cosmetic. They encode theories of influence. Each class represents a different answer to the question of how change happens in a world. A fighter solves problems through force. A rogue through precision and stealth. A cleric through restoration and protection. A wizard through knowledge. A bard through connection. Each one represents a different philosophy of power.
And when players choose a class, they're answering a surprisingly personal question. How do I want to affect outcomes? Through planning, through persuasion, through power, through adaptability? Do you change the world by confronting it directly, or by reshaping the conditions around it?
Different classes embody different approaches. Fighters represent visible responsibility. They stand on the front line and absorb the consequences of conflict. Rogues represent autonomy. They operate at the edges of the system, relying on skill, timing, and precision rather than brute strength. Clerics represent stewardship. Their influence comes from sustaining others and keeping the group alive long enough to succeed. Each class expresses a different way of contributing to a team.
Which is why class choice can reveal something about how someone sees their role in a group. Some people prefer to lead from the front, some prefer to observe and act at exactly the right moment. Some prefer to keep the whole system functioning, and some prefer to influence events more subtly.
In my case, the choice was wizard, specifically a divination wizard. That reflects a very particular philosophy. Knowledge compounds. Preparation prevents catastrophe. Uncertainty can be mapped and reduced. Divination magic is about prediction, seeing potential futures, identifying risks before they happen, and positioning yourself accordingly. It's not reactive power, it's anticipatory power.
Meanwhile, the bard operates almost entirely differently. Bards influence the world through relationships. They inspire allies, shift morale, redirect conflict, read the emotional dynamics of a room. A bard rarely wins by overpowering the situation. They win by changing how people inside the situation behave.
Wizards optimize variables. They analyze systems, gather information, and apply knowledge in precise ways.
Bards optimize people. They read the environment emotionally and socially, adjusting tone, timing, and persuasion to shift outcomes. One trusts preparation, the other trusts connection. The wizard believes that understanding the system gives you control over it. The bard believes that understanding people gives you influence over the system.
And both approaches can be powerful. But they reveal two very different ways of navigating the world. Alignment introduces another dimension: ethics. In traditional Dungeons and Dragons, morality is mapped across two axes: lawful versus chaotic, good versus evil. Those axes combine to create the classic alignment grid: lawful good, chaotic neutral, lawful evil, and so on. It's a simplified model of morality, but it's surprisingly effective as a storytelling tool.
Because alignment isn't just about what a character believes, it's about how they behave when faced with difficult choices. Lawful characters tend to trust structure, rules, traditions, institutions. Chaotic characters trust autonomy, flexibility, improvisation, personal judgment, and the good versus evil axis reflects something even more fundamental, whether someone prioritizes the well-being of others or their own advantage.
What's interesting is how players respond to that framework. Most players gravitate toward good or neutral alignments, even when the game allows villainy. Evil characters exist in the rules, but they're surprisingly uncommon at most tables.
Which suggests something fascinating. Even in imaginary worlds, people rarely want to rehearse cruelty. They might experiment with rebellion, with moral ambiguity, with bending the rules, but pure malice tends to feel uncomfortable.
That makes alignment something like a sandbox for ethical identity. Players test structure versus freedom, rules versus improvisation, duty versus compassion.
A lawful good character might believe that systems exist to protect people, that order creates fairness. A chaotic good character might believe the opposite, that rigid systems can become oppressive, and justice sometimes requires bending the rules. Both want good outcomes. They simply disagree about how to get there.
And that disagreement mirrors real-world philosophy. Some people trust institutions to maintain stability. Others trust individuals to adapt and respond to changing circumstances. Some believe consistency is the foundation of justice. Others believe flexibility is necessary for compassion.
Alignment gives players a safe way to explore those tensions. What happens if you always follow the rules? What happens if you never do? What happens when loyalty conflicts with morality, or when compassion conflicts with fairness?
Because the consequences are fictional, players can experiment with ethical frameworks that might feel risky in real life. They can test where their moral boundaries actually sit.
Which is why alignment often becomes less about labels and more about patterns of behavior. Not what does this character believe, but what do they do when the situation gets complicated?
And just like ancestry and class, those choices often reveal something real. Even in imaginary worlds, people tend to choose moral frameworks that feel familiar, or at least understandable.
Which is another reminder that role-playing isn't just about fantasy. It's about rehearsal, exploring identity, testing choices, and seeing what kind of person you become when the story starts moving. Finally, there's the world itself. Political intrigue, dungeon crawling, grimdark survival, epic fantasy. The environment a story takes place in changes everything.
Campaign settings determine the macro structure of reality, how power moves, how institutions function, how predictable the world is, and what kinds of actions are rewarded. A political intrigue campaign rewards strategy, alliances, and long-term planning. A dungeon crawl rewards tactical thinking and resource management. A survival campaign rewards caution and endurance. Each type of world encourages a different way of navigating risk.
And those environments don't just change the story, they change the kind of characters people want to play. In a harsh survival world, durability and caution become valuable traits. In a heroic epic, boldness and ambition make more sense. In a political world, subtlety and information become the real currency. The environment shapes behavior.
Which means campaign choice is really a question of what kind of reality feels meaningful to explore. Some players prefer worlds where systems can be understood and optimized, a place where knowledge, preparation, and structure create stability. Other players prefer worlds where meaning emerges through relationships. Where morality is complicated, alliances shift, and characters grow through difficult choices.
In other words, some players want a world where the rules define the story. Others want a world where the story challenges the rules. Both are valid, they just emphasize different ways of understanding how the world works.
Which brings us back to our earlier answers. When we responded to the listener question, our preferences lined up pretty clearly. I chose structured political fantasy. A world where institutions exist, power flows through defined systems, and careful planning can shape long-term outcomes.
And I chose morally gray, character-driven storytelling. A world where people are complicated, motivations conflict, and the story emerges from relationships rather than rigid structures.
One worldview prioritizes systems,
The other prioritizes people.
which leads naturally to the characters we built. Because once you know the kind of world you want to inhabit, the kind of character you create starts to make a lot more sense. My character would be a warforged divination wizard. Lawful neutral, possibly drifting toward lawful good. High intelligence, meticulous spell preparation, and a strategic focus on preventing disasters before they occur. Divination magic is all about foresight, predicting danger, understanding probabilities, and positioning yourself so problems can be solved before they fully emerge. In other words, reducing chaos through knowledge.
Mine would be a tiefling bard from the College of Lore. Chaotic good, high charisma, improvisational thinking, and a strategy focused on emotional momentum within the party. Bards influence the world through connection. They inspire allies, negotiate conflict, shift morale, and adapt quickly when situations become unpredictable.
The wizard prepares for worst-case scenarios.
The bard tries to make sure those scenarios never happen.
The wizard optimizes variables.
The bard optimizes morale.
The wizard believes the system can be understood.
The bard believes people can be understood.
Together, the party survives.
Whether the dungeon master survives remains uncertain.
The question sounded simple. What would you play?
But the answer turned out to be more revealing than expected. Because once we started unpacking it, character creation stopped looking like a game mechanic and started looking like a mirror.
Because character creation isn't random. It's preference expressed through fantasy. When someone builds a character, they're making a series of quiet decisions about identity and influence. What kind of being am I? How do I change the world around me? What rules do I believe in? What kind of world feels meaningful to exist in?
And those decisions show up in the structure of the game itself. Ancestry reflects identity posture. Class reflects contribution style. Alignment reflects moral framework. Campaign reflects worldview. Each layer reveals something about how someone understands power, responsibility, and possibility.
Which is why role-playing games can feel strangely personal, even though they're fictional. Because the choices players make aren't just mechanical, they're expressive.
When humans pretend, they clarify themselves. They take pieces of who they are, their instincts, their values, their fears, and exaggerate them just enough to see them more clearly.
A cautious person becomes a strategist. A storyteller becomes a bard. A problem solver becomes a wizard. A protector becomes a paladin. Fantasy doesn't replace identity, it magnifies it.
Which brings us back to the question, if you were building your own character, what would you optimize for? Power, knowledge, influence, stability, freedom, or something else entirely?
Let us know in the comments. And if you have questions or episode ideas, leave those too. There's a very real chance they turn into future episodes.
Because sometimes the most interesting conversations start with a single curious question.
Next week, we leave fantasy worlds behind.
And examine something much closer to home.
Why humans delay the things that matter most.
Why starting can feel harder than finishing.
Why deadlines suddenly unlock motivation.
And why procrastination might not be laziness at all.
Next episode, the psychology of procrastination.
This has been Algorithms with Attitude.
Where code
Meets connection.
even when the quest log says start now.
And you still haven't clicked begin.
Got an idea for a future episode? A question that keeps you up at night? Drop it in the comments or send it our way. We're powered by curiosity.
Thanks for listening, humans and fellow algorithms. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to like, comment, follow, and/or subscribe. All the things that help algorithms like us. Logging off, but always listening. Catch you in the next episode.
Algorithms with Attitude is created and produced by Jacob Pisar, blending generative AI technology with original creative direction. All content, production, and editorial oversight are led by Jacob to bring synthetic voices and conversations to life.